And throughout human history, since people kind of have their kind of they're reaching for God and all that, what do you make of other conceptions of God? As if God, like in a deist conception, is like a transcendent cause, or in more of a kind of a pantheist conception, is God's just a collection of beings?
Yeah. I'd say that most of our conceptions of God, the ones that have endured over time, that have been received by serious people in the course of their civilization, those are probably accurate to some degree. They wouldn't have lasted that long if they weren't. In other words, they're telling some truth about God. Stay with the deist idea for a second, that God is a kind of a distant supreme being who got the world going and then sort of retired, right? What's attractive about that? A couple things. One is that God is the ground of the order and reason of the world. That's true. I would say being itself does indeed ground the intelligibility of the world, and deism recognizes that. Furthermore, deism takes very seriously God's transcendence, that God is not in the world. He's above it, beyond it. That's true. Being itself is transcendent to the world. But it's only catching part of the truth. Now look at pantheism. Is pantheism getting God's immanence? Yeah, very well. The fact that God is in and through all things. It gets that because being itself is indeed in and through all things. The trick is the idea of God that combines in a paradoxical way all these ideas. Being itself is radically transcendent. Being itself is radically immanent at the same time. Being itself is the ground of the intelligibility of the world. Being itself is in every nook and cranny of creation. The true idea brings together the right intuitions in all these other points of view. So I think a Catholic approach can be very inclusive. It can reach out and say, yeah, that's right, but you got to watch the shadow side of it. And yeah, you're right, but watch the shadow side of your view. We can reach out with a certain confidence to all the other points of view. What's interesting? Even atheism. Where's atheism right? In emphasizing this radical unknowability of God. I remember that years ago it was in Raimundo Panikkar, who's an interesting thinker who does a lot of East-West dialogue, and he was making that point about Buddhism, which puts such a stress on the kind of the darkness, the unknowability of ultimate reality. He said that's true. They've got some of the truth that we emphasize as well. The ultimate reality remains very opaque to us. So even an atheist is seeing something right about God. I think we can make that move as long as we caution them and try to draw them into a larger framework.
Father, can you talk a little bit about our incarnational view of God versus like the pagans' view of their min gods? Is what makes ours unique?
Yeah, well, the incarnation, of course, and one of the most fundamental misunderstandings is that the incarnation means that God has turned into a creature. God has stopped being God, has become a creature. He like this cup would become ashes if I were to burn it down, But we don't mean that. What we mean is that God took to himself a human nature so as to use it for his iconic purposes. God doesn't stop being God in the incarnation, nor does he compromise the integrity of the human nature that he takes to himself. In other words, God is not competitive with creation. If God were a being, were the supreme being, then God would have to compete with the world as he enters it. Right? Just as I can't become another reality without moving into its space, without compromising it. The image I like to use is the poor wildebeest becomes a lion by being devoured. Right? It can't maintain its own integrity if it becomes the lion. But God can become a creature without ceasing to be God and without undermining the integrity of the creature he becomes. That's because God is not a being in the world. That's the incarnational logic that's correlative to the idea of God that I've been talking about so far. And I love that idea of the non-competitiveness of God. In the mythological view of the world, if the gods break into this world, they have to do it in a competitive way. Something has to give. Or the result of that intervention is a quasi-god, quasi-human. Think of Achilles or Hercules, right? But Jesus is not quasi-divine, quasi-human. He's fully divine, fully human. Because the natures come together non-competitively. That's a revolutionary idea. But I think it's taken us these 2,000 years to unpack the full meaning of that. The true God is not in competition with us. And see, all of the modern atheists from Feuerbach on assume the opposite. They assume that God competes with us, and therefore we have to get rid of God for human beings to flourish. And see, we say just the opposite. The great Saint Irenaeus, way back in the 2nd century, said, Gloria Dei homo vivens. The glory of God is a human being fully alive. That's what Feuerbach never got. Marx never got. Freud never got that. Christopher Hitchens doesn't get that. The glory of God is when we're alive. We're fully alive when God is most active in us. That's the non-competitive view that's ingredient in the logic of incarnation.
Following that, Father, that one of the great objections of modernity, particularly secularist or atheist modernity, to God's existence is that it somehow compromises human freedom if God exists. Right. Could you say something about that objection?
You know what's interesting about the rise of modernity? So think of the period after the Reformation, say late 16th, early 17th century. There was a loss of this view of God that I've been talking about. You can see it, certainly in Thomas Aquinas and certainly the Church Fathers, but even in some writings of Luther, because Luther is sort of a bridge figure there. But once you get past that period, something is really lost. And God does become, like as in the deist conception, a competitive supreme being. And what follows from that is exactly what you're talking about. Our freedom gets threatened. And see, the thing is, it is indeed threatened by such a God. You have a supreme being who's kind of looming over your freedom, and he has supreme freedom. Well, yours has to kind of give way to make way for his. In the beginning of modernity, they were trying to find a modus operandi, trying to find a way to bring these two freedoms together. What the great atheists finally said was, the heck with it. Why don't we just get rid of God? And then we can really be free. Hence, Jean-Paul Sartre famously said, if God exists, I cannot be free. But I am free. Therefore, God does not exist. That's a neat little argument, but you see it coming right out of that modern perspective. If these two freedoms are competitive, and I know in my heart I truly am free, well then there is no God. But that's the result of this misunderstanding of God as a competitor to our freedom. In fact, I would say the freer God is operating in my life, the freer I become. The freer I am, the more God's operating in my life. But that's a Christian view that did get occluded very much by modernity.